Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to welcome you at our series of lectures as part of our online series of lecture focused on the ongoing war in Ukraine. My name is Anna Sashenko. I'm a coordinator of the Russia platform at Ghent University. I would like to introduce you our speaker of today, Rashid Gabdulhakov from the Center for Media and Journalism Studies at the University of Groningen. His research focuses on digital vigilantism, which is a phenomenon emerging on a global scale, which sees digital audiences using social platforms to shape social and political life. Rashid has also expertise in such topics as social media surveillance, affordances, and governance. In 2021, Rashid defended his PhD dissertation with the title Digital Vigilantism in Russia, Citizen-led Justice in the Context of Social Change and Social Harm. He also co-edited an open access book on vigilant audiences. In the lecture of today, Rashid will address the state of the traditional and social media in Russia since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. I think it wouldn't be an underestimation to say that the role of the media and its impact on the audiences in this war is huge. Meanwhile, access to independent sources of news online and across social media platforms have been significantly cut off by the Russian government through a whole range of sanctions. So I think it's very important to have a clear vision on the current state of affairs and the Russian media landscape and the consequences of the imposed sanctions for the near future. So we are very happy to have Rashid today with us for his lecture. Before I give the floor to Rashid, let me provide you with some technical information and instructions. As attendees of this lecture, you will be not able to turn on your camera and microphone during the events. But if you want to ask questions to the speaker, you are most welcome to do that in the chat. After the lecture, there will be time for a Q&A session, so our speaker can answer the questions you might have. You do not need to wait till then with putting your questions in the chat, so feel free to post your questions during the lecture. The lecture will be also recorded and published online on our YouTube channel. So I think that's it. Rashid, the floor is yours.
Anna, thank you so much for this warm introduction. Thank you for having me. Great pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss this topic today. Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining, for expressing your interest in this topic. Lots of new names I see on the list of participants. Some people I know, which is great and warms my heart to see. So let me start by sharing my presentation, and I hope the screen works. Yeah, so once again, Anna, because you already provided the roadmap, I don't have to go into the detail of what the lecture will be about. That's quite clear. But I do want to emphasize the fact that in order to understand the state of Russian media now, we do have to address some of the historical nuances, especially given the fact that a lot of the discourses, a lot of the language a lot of the discourses are being repackaged. A lot of the language is being reused again, and we hear this echo of the 90s, echo of the 2000s, and these discourses are sort of intertwined. And not only it is the content, but it also the form, the structure, the media system in which these discourses are being presented. Therefore, I do want us to have this a bit of a back and forth between what's happening now and maybe some of the echoes of the past that we once again hear. One quick disclaimer also, I'm a father of a little boy who is currently sleeping. And normally I'm quite a loud person, but I will try to keep my voice at a reasonable volume so I don't wake him up. But I might get carried away, in which case, if he wakes up, I might need to run and calm him. So I'm not running away from the audience, but I have parental duties to take care of since the lecture is taking place in the evening. Discussion points. We will talk about Russian media system, and once again, the system is intertwined with different domains, be it business or clearly politics. But also the system is a phenomenon, or is a notion, I guess, is a combination of notions that take place in that is informed by time and different historical events. So we will address those. And of course, the regime, the control strategies over the internet in Russia, because the digital domain plays a special role in the alternative narrative to the official regime's position, because traditional media is at this point, under complete control of the state. I would like to start by this couple of quotes, and this one is by Dmitry Medvedev from 2011, who at the meeting with young supporters of his said the following: "The internet is an open platform. The issue is the legal separation of forbidden things that are subject to unconditional eradication from those things that we may not like, and they may even be immoral, but we have to preserve them due to the features of the internet." Quite an interesting take, especially given the fact that if we fast forward 10 years to 2021, in a similar meeting with young supporters, Vladimir Putin said the following: "The internet has penetrated into all spheres of our life. By and large, it must still obey not just the laws as formal rules, but also the moral laws of the society in which we live. Otherwise, the society will collapse from within." Quite an interesting turn. 10 years, 1 decade. One vision was that the internet is a free space, and that things that we may not like and things that may be immoral in nature have to still be tolerated, to another type of discourse, to another type of vision of the internet, that it has to obey the moral laws of the society. Moreover, that's not the only quote from 2021. In Putin's vision, the internet is a source of child pornography, child prostitution, promotion and distribution of drugs, and a space where adolescents are being pulled to the streets to fight with the police and to do all kinds of, to engage in hooliganism and misbehavior and to get in trouble. Basically, once again, portraying the internet as this dangerous space where it's best not to go, it's best not to engage, it's best to avoid the internet. Because the internet clearly presents a threat to the legitimacy of the regime by offering alternative narratives. And again, just a quick reminder, just to understand where we are, because when Medvedev was in power, he was perceived as this technologically advanced president. He traveled to the States and met with Steve Jobs. He was seen as in public almost inseparable from his iPad, active on Twitter, meeting with the rock stars, like in this case Deep Purple, I believe, and of course also having the army of supporters, the so-called Medvedev girls. Why this is important is because there is I want to address the topic of relationship between the state and the youth. And on the other hand, you have Putin, and the portrayal of his persona is a bit different. Yeah, so not necessarily technologically savvy, more old school, enjoying nature with his longtime buddy Shoigu. Nevertheless, also surrounded by female supporters. And with these images, I just want to demonstrate the awkward attempts of the state, of the regime, Putin's regime, since day one, pretty much, to engage young people in politics. And the reason why they're awkward is because quite often they're top down. They are, they lack authenticity, and moreover, they're rather staged. Yeah, so you have this kind of they're staged also within the kind of old, rusty, patriarchal, sexist structures. Where, the president is meeting with the brides, supposedly quite randomly at the Red Square, although none of the brides were accompanied by the grooms for some reason, so we're waiting without a groom, and so on. And of course, the very dynamic between the two, presidents and persons who were engaged in this gambit, switching each other up. So eventually, Medvedev went from being a persona pretty much number 2 in the country to a bit of a somewhere down the pyramid of the hierarchy of power. And his image was also consequently destroyed, so to speak, in the media. It was allowed to make fun of Medvedev. He became kind of a scapegoat of the regime, where maybe all of the frustrations or some of the anger of the public could be taken not to the person number 1 in the media domain, but to the person number 2, eventually 3, 4, or even 5. And the image of Dmitry Medvedev was eventually kind of peripheral. But Putin's image also evolved. We will be going back and forth, like I mentioned, between the past and the present, but some of the recent images, and of course there are pictures from the meeting with Emmanuel Macron at the unnecessarily long table, or meeting with Viktor Orban at the unnecessarily large carpet that separates the leaders from each other. But also even during the meetings with his very own generals, supporters, buddies, if you will. We see the distancing of the president, and that is also something that is circulating in the media to the point that the spokespersons of Putin had to even explain what was happening, and not to mention all the hundreds of thousands of memes that were circulating the internet in this regard. But to understand where we are, once again, we have to understand the past. So let me give you a brief overview. If for some of you this is redundant, just bear with me. If some of you will learn something new, just relax, sit down. It's Tuesday evening. Enjoy your drink, and let me walk you through a bit of history of the Russian media. What I hear now, because my method is within the nethnography. I conduct online observations, I conduct discourse analysis, thematic analysis, and so on. I hear this phrase continuously, that the digital iron curtain is back. In fact, I use it myself. The digital iron curtain is back. But let's go back to the actual iron curtain. What was happening in the Soviet Union? 73 years of the Soviet rule, most of which was described as the Iron Curtain, especially post-World War II, is basically this vacuum of information. You can no information coming in, no information leaving, or very little bit, that something that can seep through, or people making their own alternative narratives. Nevertheless, everything is quite state-controlled, because even when people were engaged in the so-called samizdat, making newspapers in their kitchens, and the typewriters, even these typewriters were registered with the KGB, and you could backtrack even with that primitive, nowadays primitive, back then it was of course quite revolutionary, but even with that technology, there was state control over the narrative, or the creators and spreaders of that narrative. Quite remarkable was the fact that one of the main newspapers in the country was called Pravda, or the Truth, and you can sense something quite fictional, almost Orwellian, that the main newspaper, one of the main newspapers in the country, can be simply called The Truth. Then, of course, this is a very surface level excursion into the history, so we are jumping quite quickly ahead. But then came the end of 1980s, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, and there was a moment of hope. Eventually, in 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the soundtrack I'm playing of this song by the band Scorpions, the German band Scorpions, "The Wind of Change." There was this moment of hope. quite interesting, again, to that point that these historical moments are now being repackaged. Recently, the band Scorpions that wrote the song in 1990, I think, amid these changes in the global political dynamics, amid the changes they observed in the Soviet Union and eventually in Russia, they had to speak up and change lyrics, that they don't walk down the Moscow River anymore, but and it's not in Moscow, but it's more hopes for Ukraine. Quite remarkable. Again, quite quickly, because humor is important now, but humor was also important back then. Of course, in the moments at different points of the Soviet rule, humor was quite controlled, but in the mid-80s, towards the end, it was a bit unleashed in the sense that the comics, or the humoristi, as they were called in the Soviet Union, the stand-uppers, they were allowed to criticize the state. They were allowed to make fun of the state suddenly. They were allowed to make fun of realities, of the surroundings, of the fact that there is nothing to eat, of the fact that the industry is suffering, or things that are produced in the Soviet Union are just of poor quality. And that sort of fed in to this general mood of public disenchantment with the state, sort of the king is naked kind of a situation, right, where people were suddenly allowed to admit what they see. One of the many examples that I can bring, but I think one of the vivid examples is the so-called funeral of food in Moscow that was performed in the 1990, because the shelves were empty, there was nothing to eat, that these comedians performed this kind of symbolic funeral of the food. We are saying goodbye to food. People were disappointed at home, but they were in awe with the West. That was a very interesting period of time. Empty shelves, this transition to the new order, the loss of socioeconomic status of the masses. Yet people were curious about, and with hopes, even they looked at what the West came in with, or the promise of the West. And one of the vivid, or speaking for itself, examples is that first McDonald's that was opened in Moscow, with the line so long that the concept of fast food was challenged, because it could take you 8 hours to get a burger, a Coke, and fries. So the fast food was delivered quite slowly, but people were curious about this product, about this place where you can come and get this interesting service where people smile, and where you can get products maybe that you are trying for the first time. In any case, I'm not an advocate of McDonald's as a dietary option, but the fact of the matter is the phenomenon of people being in awe with the West, people being attracted to the Western products. And once again, just like with the band Scorpions, this very McDonald's, this very first McDonald's in Moscow, symbolically echoes again, now amid the invasion of Ukraine, now amid this war, as when McDonald's announced its exodus from the Russian market, temporary. This was one of the first stores to close doors and to actually take down all the McDonald's paraphernalia, and it became a symbol that moment of openness, that moment of collaboration, that moment. Well, I think the best word to describe this moment is openness. That moment of openness is gone, and now the door is closed again. That was quite symbolic, quite the embodiment of that. So it was not only about the food, of course, it was also about culture, music, and there were subcultures during the Soviet rule, of course, but people also lived in the reality where wearing jeans or listening to certain vinyls, certain music could get you in trouble with the police. And suddenly in 1989, the Moscow Peace Festival, we see that the Western bands come in, and you see them even hanging out with the Soviet police. An image unheard of. Again, we are looking at it maybe thinking it's a bit silly. Yeah, there is motley crew here wearing spandex. There are the police officers, and it's maybe silly and funny to us. But this was a revolutionary image of 1989 during the Moscow Peace Festival. And music is once again super important because the lyrics, the bands are once again being controlled, being proclaimed as being deemed as the enemies of the people if they dare challenge the state, or even if they dare use such a word as peace. Again, I'm skipping really fast to the 90s. So that was the end of 80s, beginning of 90s, the moment of hope and openness. Then came a moment of, I would describe it as chaos. Anything for your money. The TV was no longer controlled by the central state, but it was controlled by people with money. So, and I'm using that examples that, in my opinion, are the most vivid of that period of time. But to illustrate to you that everything was possible, I will just show you a quick clip here of Alan Chumak. He was this healer that appeared on TV prime time, and he healed people through television. He would ask you to put in front of the TV some lotions, water, bread, newspaper. He would charge it with his waves through television. Then you would use these products, eat the bread, use the lotion, and you would heal. People were even invited to put the part of their body that is in pain towards the TV to get the healing. Again, this is primetime television.
Я рад нашей встрече. Как обычно, сядьте поудобнее.
Sit down, relax, and I'm skipping. There will be a link if you would like to receive some healing, or if you want to get access to this as an interesting media artifact. You can also find it on YouTube. You see? So considering the price of seconds of airtime on television, that's quite remarkable. For quite some time, a person could be healing via television. Nevertheless, there was also political content present. An image here is illustrating and I'm skipping, as you can imagine, because you can see the character here on the left. Putin is already among one of the characters. It's the show called Kukli, or Puppets, or Dolls, that was aired on the broadcaster called NTV. And it was quite the political satire that illustrated also a new period of time where money could not only buy you odd commercials or strange promotions of yourself so that you can then go on a tour around the country and heal people for money, but money could also buy you political agenda that you could exude through television and, of course, set your interests up front. And some of the hot topics were even discussed, such as the drowning of the Kursk submarine, or the explosions in Moscow residential buildings of 1999 that justified the Second Chechen campaign. Quite remarkable. Once again, skipping quickly forward, we covered the 80s, we covered the 90s. On the last day of the 20th century, a remarkable event happened that shocked pretty much everyone when Boris Yeltsin announced that he is leaving his post and he is appointing his protege Vladimir Putin as interim president, and eventually Putin won the elections. Was that the beginning of the new era once again for Russia? I would argue yes. That was the beginning, and as a media scholar, for me, in terms of media and openness and hope, that was the beginning of the end of that hope and of that openness. Because quite quickly, from day one, there were a number of programs launched to gain complete, full, and ultimate, total control over the strategic narrative at home, eventually abroad as well. first of all, on the domestic scene, the television turned into a one-man show. Of course, NTV was stormed and appropriated by the regime-loyal oligarchs. And we have to understand here that ownership was sometimes direct, sometimes indirect, sometimes difficult to track even, but nevertheless always loyal to the state. A one-man show on TV, forget about Kukli, forget anything else. It's Putin meeting with someone, or being a superhero, basically, diving to the bottom of the lake and finding ancient artifacts, being on a submarine, being on a horse in the outdoors, fishing, etc., flying with the birds. Basically, a one-man superhero show is television. There was absolutely no room for criticism, and a clear signal was sent to the journalists. Anna Politkovskaya, an outspoken critic of the regime and especially the Second Chechen campaign, was murdered at the entry to her apartment complex, apartment block, on the 7th of October 2006, which also happens to be Putin's birthday. Investments were also made into, of course, investments of public money, was also made into the international broadcasting. One of the infamous broadcasters, of course, is the RT, formerly Russia Today. Evidently, it no longer stands for that. The abbreviation simply is RT. And what's interesting about RT is that when it appeared, especially mid 2000s, in the West and in the liberal circles, it was perceived as the wave of fresh air. People were looking at RT as an alternative to the so-called dinosaur broadcasters of the West, because it was covering topics that were maybe not making it on the mainstream agenda of again, global corporations, based in the US or in the UK, or that certain perspectives were being delivered. And that was, of course, that didn't live long until pretty much the invasion of Georgia in 2008, when it became clear that RT is a source of the official position of the regime in Russia. And not only is it the source of that information, it is also the way that information is delivered is quite clever, in the sense that it's delivered in different languages with domestically tailored content for audiences globally. And that's when the alarms were being set off, that okay, are we exposing our citizens to propaganda, let's say in the US or in Spain or in Germany, by allowing RT to broadcast. And of course now, since the invasion of Ukraine, we see that there was a harsh response at this point to RT or Sputnik, which is next in line, because in 2014, Sputnik was also launched. Again, an international broadcaster, again, with quite clear strategies, sometimes even delivering, for example, I'll give you an example of Sputnik's role in Central Asia. So when I do some of the content analysis on Central Asian media platforms, things tend to disappear. Sputnik offered quite a more or less reliable archive, in the sense that you can go and you can find some news of what was happening, let's say in the early days of the pandemic, for example. Some of those news disappeared from the official broadcasters or newspapers, let's say in Uzbekistan, but Sputnik with the local office maintains those articles. So forcing people to rely on it, I guess the media system of these countries forces some of the audience members to rely on Sputnik, to rely on Russian platforms, and of course quite digitally savvy, quite active on social media and delivering messages in a tailored manner, different languages, and of course with quite the agenda. Investments were also made into the chief propagandists, and here we can see that there is again this dynamic between demonstrating to the public, demonstrating to the media professionals of what can happen to you if you criticize the state, and what can happen to you if you join the state and if you work for the state. Yeah, people are getting state recognition medals and orders, and receiving huge salaries and enjoying fancy lifestyles. But for that, every evening on television, they have to, of course, terrify the audiences by telling them how awful life is in Europe or in the United States, how great life is in Russia, and how everyone is wanting to destroy Russia and put it back on its knees. So if you look at some of the narratives or some of the discourses or themes that are being discussed, these informative, quote unquote, programs usually operate within the same scenario, that life is tough in the West and in Europe. It's immoral, quite interesting. Life is immoral there. There are homosexual families taking kids from straight families, and so on and so forth. Children are often a main character in these information programs. Children are instrumentalized as this sentimental point. Christianity is, of course, sentimentalized as also basically the moral prism, and that there is this global plot, of course, orchestrated by Western powers, which are orchestrated by the United States, where there is this idea of putting Russia back on its knees. It's repeated like mantra that Russia was once number one, number two, kind of competing with the US in this bipolar world. And then it was put on its knees in the 90s. No one regarded Russia as a power anymore. Now, because of Putin, that power is back, but those evil plotters want to take this power back again. So this is the narrative. And it's quite important because the way this war, the current war, is justified now is also these discourses, these narratives, they're not taken out of thin air. The audiences have been conditioned for decades. The audiences have been conditioned for over 2 decades now to think or to perceive the world within this prism, that there is a global plot against Russia to put it back on its knees, to capture power, to destroy Russia, to make it dissolve, just like they did in 1990s, 1991, and that only Putin can protect Russia's sovereignty. And here again was a picture of Vladimir Solovyov receiving the medal from Putin for his work. Quite a remarkable character, Vladimir Solovyov, actually. So he's on the news now amid the alleged assassination attempt, but quite a critic of the West with property in Italy. And this moment of time, so we've covered the 80s, we've covered the 90s, we've covered 2000s, but with the penetration of the internet, with the spread of social media, a new challenge for the regime emerged, and that's, of course, the online narratives. One of the key figures in this challenge, of course, is Alexei Navalny and his team, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, FBK, who relied on the digital tools quite successfully to expose the state. Many products that they have released, some of the loud ones, of course, is On Vam Ne Dimon, or Don't Call Him Dimon, exposing Dmitry Medvedev and his riches, his wineries and his posh lifestyle and so on. Quite an interesting approach to these investigations as well. They can investigate by the shirt, how much it cost, by the position of the trees and the fences in the Instagram photos. If we go back to the example with Medvedev, they can understand where he was, his geolocation, and then fly a drone over that property and then investigate the property and find the owners. And of course, another loud product that the team released last year was the Palace for Putin, the history of the biggest bribe in the world, showing the palace in Gelendzhik that is worth more than $1 billion. And of course, amid the poverty or the social economic struggles in Russia, that is quite the revelation to show these riches that the powerful people in Russia enjoy, or that the people who are supporting the regime enjoy. Here it's important to, of course, mention that there are vulnerabilities and immunities online, because some people who are, especially those who already have different types of powers offline, they might be immune to these exposures. In fact, yes, this video, the Palace for Putin, received an incredible amount of views, 100 million views in the first 10 days. But we have to ask ourselves several questions. First of all, were they domestic or foreign? And even if some of them were domestic, however many million, did it make a difference in the perception of Putin, in the perception of his power? And platforms do play an important role here. Platforms are not apolitical. Platforms are political. Platforms can and do play an important role. For instance, one of the examples amid these exposures, amid these revelations of Navalny and his team of FBK, Anti-Corruption Foundation, Instagram was pressured to delete the video of an oligarch, Deripaska, partying with prostitutes on a yacht with the Deputy Prime Minister Prihodko. Yeah? So Instagram deleted this video, stepping in as a moderator, content moderator, but also depriving the audiences of the opportunity to see. There are reasons for that, of course. I mean, these platforms are businesses, and Roskomnadzor, the Russian censor organization, did send a signal. Yeah, this is a Soviet term again, sending a signal. They did send a signal to basically a showcase to other platforms by banning LinkedIn in 2016. LinkedIn was an easy target. No one cares about LinkedIn in Russia. If you block LinkedIn, no one will come to the Red Square protesting. So LinkedIn was chosen as an easy target to demonstrate that, hey, if you don't obey by our rules, if you don't store data on Russian soil, give us access to it, or if you don't delete certain content when we ask you to do so, we may deprive you of access to the market. There were other attempts, of course, by slowing Twitter and sending other messages. And now, of course, all of these attempts have taken quite a different approach. There are no games anymore. Basically, some of these platforms are deemed extremist. There are domestic alternatives in Russia, of course. So if we talk about the environments in which discussions can take place, or political news can be discussed or consumed, or can penetrate into the feeds of audience members. Mail.ru Group, again, I'm not going to go into too many details, but there are domestic alternatives. Quite remarkable is the fact that Telegram Messenger, which is now becoming a go-to platform, pretty much platform number one amid the current exodus from Western platforms in Russia for various reasons. One of them being the impossibility of monetization, another one being the deeming some of these platforms as extremist, and the fears that by even having this platform on your phone or by posting on it, you can suffer legal consequences. Nevertheless, amid this exodus, Telegram is becoming a #1 platform. But Telegram doesn't want to affiliate itself with Russia. Yeah, the founder of Telegram, Pavel Durov, who is also a founder of Vkontakte, platform that was racketeered from him in 2014, pretty much makes clear statements that he should not be labeled as a Russian programmist anymore, a Russian developer, and that Telegram is not a Russian platform. Although quite interesting is that the fact that in 2018 the state in Russia attempted to block Telegram, didn't succeed, seems like almost abandoned this idea of blocking Telegram, and now you see politicians and entire state structures opening channels on Telegram. On Telegram, affordances allow you to open a channel, unlike WhatsApp, let's say, and the audiences can consume information that you share, but also can react with comments and otherwise. Legislation has also been instrumentalized by the regime, and there are numerous examples. Some of the amendments that were made to existing laws to make them applicable to the digital domain Yeah, so for instance, we have seen this wave of social media user arrests, or the waves of pressure applied on social media users in Russia in 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 18. Eventually, Putin even had to decriminalize some of these legislative packages to soften the retaliation. It doesn't mean that everything suddenly became quite nice and lovely. That was just a symbolic gesture, because I will get to this in a couple of slides. I did a study on what posts or what reactions online can get you in trouble, and also what kind of reactions followed from the state. And of course, one of the other prominent legislative acts or legislative tools in the hands of the state now is the so-called foreign agent law. Yeah? You can label not only institutions, not only broadcasters, not only NGOs, but also individuals as a foreign agent, and that law is also tightening and tightening. And just now, in the Gosduma, or in the Parliament of Russia, they have spoken up with yet another proposition to tighten this the activities of foreign agents even further. Basically, you are making a group of deviants, and the idea is to make it impossible for them to engage in their work. Moreover, if everything began with the idea that you are a foreign agent if you receive funding from abroad, which again was quite complicated, because what does it mean to get funding? Is your YouTube monetization, is it already funding by a foreign government or by a foreign entity? Now things are even more complex, because you don't even have to receive funding. You have to be ideologically with someone who is not Russia. So basically anyone, again, virtually anyone challenging the state can be deemed a foreign agent. And it's not just the label that you have to reveal, but it comes with a package of acts that limit your activity, basically making you a deviant, and in many cases forcing you to leave the country. Pressure on the users, so likes, shares, and dislikes. This is not new again, so that is the reason why I want us to have this discussion in the kind of historical perspective, opening each new chapter as a sort of a book, because it's not just something that suddenly came from the sky, that users are being pressured. It has been a system for quite some time. In reaction to the online challenges, the state has been working on a system. Ideally, of course, they would have had something like the firewall in China, but at that point of time, technologically and financially, it was difficult for the state to play out that type of control over the domestic online narratives. So instead, they instrumentalized fear. In my study, I looked at almost 1,000 cases of social media user arrests or pressure applied on social media, litigation against social media users in Russia. And quite remarkable examples, and because of the time, I will only show one that I find quite illustrative of the reality. We see here a parliament member, Milonov, wearing a shirt that says "Orthodoxy or Death." Here we see an activist, Simonov, who shared a photograph of the parliament member by saying basically, hey, take a look at our policymaker. And the police came, I guess I should have asked the audience, who do you think the police came after? I think you know the answer. The police came after the activist. Law is applied selectively. Practically anyone can get arrested for virtually anything. Any activity online can be used against you if needed. That is the reality, and that has been a reality for a while. Instrumentalization of fear to force people to self-censor. In my study, I identified the following types of user arrests. Some of them are, in fact, real. So, we have to be objective in this discussion. Some people were nationalists, some people were xenophobic in the discussions or in the things they write, tweet, or post or comment online. Does it, however, is it proportional? Is the punishment proportional is another question. Some of these arrests were tactical, made-up cases targeting state critics, just like in the case with Simonov. He was already outspoken, he was already a state critic, and because of that, any activity online can be used against him. Interestingly enough, he was fined for this post on Facebook. He left the court and he, I think, tweeted or made a post on Facebook. I don't quite remember which platform exactly, and it doesn't necessarily make a difference. But he shared the outcome of the court hearing, and he was, invited to the court again because he reshared some of this content that was deemed dangerous. So tactical targeting. Other types of user arrests or pressure applied on users was practical, targeting people with limited financial and social capital so that police could fill their quotas. It is an already difficult and dangerous environment when the police are using the law selectively. And this reality is in double jeopardy when police are equipped with quotas that they need to fill. That means that they will find scapegoats, people who cannot make a lot of noise, let's say, online or on media, people with limited support, limited capacity, limited capital, so they can fill their quotas and get higher up in the rankings. And because of the nature of the system, where even a like can get you in trouble, the language of this legislation that describes terrorism or extremism, interreligious or interethnic hatred, it is so vague that if you're a historian working with artifacts from World War II, you might be litigated against for spreading Nazi paraphernalia. Some of the cases were random. Accidental persons were facing the law because of the vague definitions and broad interpretation. So this is the system in a nutshell. We can go into nuances in the discussions, but I also looked at the types of activities. Yes, so for instance, okay, are there themes, let's say rough themes? There are some rough themes, or there have been some rough themes. If you're posting, tweeting, liking things about at that point, it was more relevant, so with Donbass, yeah, or Crimea. If you say that Crimea is Ukraine, you could get in trouble. So challenging Russia's vision over Ukraine. Another theme, of course, is orthodoxy. Quite interesting. You could not, taking a picture, showing your body parts in front of the church, get in trouble. Another theme was criticizing the state. So the untouchables, the ruling elites are untouchable. If you're tweeting about them, if you're criticizing them, if you're posting, especially on Vkontakte. Vkontakte is an important platform here because the predominant number of cases concerned Vkontakte platform. And another theme was protest. If you're inviting people to protest, saying, even giving an address where the protest will be, chances are they will come after you. People were clever, of course, saying, we are not inviting you to a protest, we are inviting you to take a walk and this address. Nevertheless, these were roughly the themes. So what type of media system is it? There have been different takes, scholarly takes. Sarah Oates describes it as neo-Soviet. Vartanova described it as statist commercialized. There were ideas on this concept of agitainment, where foreign media products were adapted to local context in Russia, especially with huge politicization of discussions. Toipfel and Litvinenko proposed these authoritarian publics where leadership critical, policy critical, or uncritical publics are operating, and of course attempts have been made to make the public not critical, or less leadership critical but more policy critical. So it's not the leadership that is to blame, but maybe more regional actors, corrupt regional leaders, low-hanging fruit, so to speak, or policy itself, or not to be critical again. And in my latest publication, I propose a different type of public. I say that it is less and less possible to be leadership critical, policy critical, but what is still possible is to be citizen critical. You're allowed to criticize other citizens. It's not like everything is just closed. You can use YouTube, you can have your own channel, But if your topic is either unpolitical at all, so uncritical, or if it criticizes citizens for not being supportive of the state, then it's also quite welcomed. A point of no return was, of course, February 2022. I don't put February 24 precisely because, again, there were events preceding to that. The recognition of the independence of the so-called LNR, DNR, and so on and so forth. But that is another point. So we have covered this history, and I know there's always a tendency to run over time, but 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, 2020, and in this period of 30 years, 22 have been under Putin, 23 almost, because of the appointment as an interim president. And over these years, everything has been done to close that initial openness or to get a grip over it, to get complete control. First with the traditional media, then with the digital media. 2022, February, point of no return. All masks are off. As a media scholar, for me, it's almost a challenge to study anything. I don't need to go and look at the themes anymore because it's complete anarchy. Anyone can be arrested for anything. People standing with a blank sheet of paper, wiped off, carried away by 20 police officers. People standing in front of the camera saying that they support the war, carried away. It's insanity. It is such a state of control and surveillance in which even the very act of standing in front of the camera can lead to a reaction from the police. Here, of course, is the photograph of Putin, and again, this new mantra that we were given no chance to act differently. Now I'm headed towards the landing of my speech, and because I want to answer some of the questions, but quickly, I think it's quite important to run through some of the discourses. So I monitor these different groups, and especially of interest to me are the groups of Russophones and Russians in Europe. These groups on Odnoklassniki, Vkontakte, Facebook, and I monitor them, and I operate only with open groups. I should also say that because in ethnography, ethics are quite important. Even though a lot more interesting things can happen in closed groups, I have to operate in open groups for ethical reasons. But even in the open groups, this is what's being shared. So it's not only domestically in Russia, but the following examples are, for instance, in Germany, amid the Russophones being shared, that we are against the war. We all oppose the war that Ukraine started 8 years ago. So Russia invades Ukraine, but this war, this invasion is framed as a war that was started by Ukraine 8 years ago. There was this mantra-like discourse that for 8 years they have been bombing the children of Donbass. For 8 years they have been bombing the children of Donbass. Kind of repeated from every channel. For a while that was the main mantra. Then the mantra changed. Eventually it became the NATO wanting to capture Russia, to dismiss it, then it was, of course, the biological weapons in Ukraine, the new mantra. So the discourse changes, the codes in it change, but the structure through which they are delivered to the audiences, they are the same. Again, Putin did not start any wars, but he finished quite a few. This Z sign, again, quite the discussion point. What is this За победу, за Отечество? Why Z? Because it doesn't exist in the Cyrillic alphabet. Some explain it as just this, as an illustration of how poor things are managed by the regime, that these chief propagandists can come up with this poor strategy with a symbol that is just made up from scratch, just to give people something to hold on to. And many mysteries around where, so there is also Z, there is V, right? So some explain it as initially it was the marking of the hardware, military hardware, depending on where it was coming from to invade Ukraine, from Crimea, Russia, Chechnya, from air, from sea. Z, V, Z in squared, T, O, X, and so on. But the Z and V became the kind of symbols. Yeah, so За Отечество, if you look at the first one, you see there is the reference. History is quite important. Once again, there is a reference to World War II, and World War II, of course, has been instrumentalized by the regime for quite some time now. And they're making this reference that we fought and won fascism then, and we will win over fascists and nationalists again, because this war, this invasion, is framed in Russia as a denazification process of Ukraine. I am on my own land, quite a remarkable one. That one statement contains so much of the discourse that comes out of the Russian leadership. And I know I've abused this word in my presentation, discourse, but if anything, this demonstration of power, this demonstration of own position in history and in the global political domain and in the political map of the world, by saying that Ukraine doesn't exist, right? Ukraine has no right to exist. It was made by Russia. And I'm on my own land as a Russian soldier. That is an illustration. Again, children predominantly present in these discourses. May all the children in this world have a peaceful sky above their head tomorrow. Quite the controversial statement, because the next one says, who has seen death, that person knows who we are. We are Russia's special forces. And this one picture here, where is the party? Here we are, right? Domestic narratives on the news, just for fun, sort of. Okay, it's not the right word to use. It's quite the. It's the opposite of fun. But today I looked at the number one channel one, number one source of propaganda in Russia for domestic audiences. You can come in tomorrow. You can look at the preceding weeks. It's the same scenario. Putin did something great to the society, lowered the percentage on mortgages, or gave some medals to the Paralympic team, to the Olympic team, and then everything is about Ukraine. This kind of sandwich news. Here's something great for our society. Here's what's happening in Ukraine. Every single headline. And of course, Ukraine is, the language that is used as Ukraine is a fascist state, it's a terrorist state, and Russian soldiers are clearing it off of the Nazis. Quickly back to Medvedev. He's gone from Twitter. Well, he still has an account, hasn't been active since this post on 16 March. He said anyone who is interested, and he's providing a link to his Telegram channel. Pretty much a lot of the celebrities did the same. I will just quickly run through some of the reactions. First of all, take a look at how many likes, 365. On a good day, a cat photo can get many more, but a lot of comments, almost 2,000 comments, and comments are remarkable because normally there would be the so-called Russian trolls, trying to dilute the discussion, but here it's almost predominantly one-sided criticism of the state. Basically sending Dmitry Medvedev to faraway places, saying, some of the slur. If you understand Russian, you maybe can read. If you don't, I will just say some, basically containing swear words, sending them to faraway places, or saying that, The Hague is waiting for you. As far as platforms are concerned, in response to Instagram, initial demonetization and consequent proclamation of it as a terrorist platform, there is a promise to open Rosgram, the Russian alternative, Russian response to Instagram. It hasn't been, the opening has been delayed for quite some time now, and it still is nowhere to be launched. Russian celebrities are crying over the loss of their potential loss of their Instagram followers, or the loss of ability to make money. Celebrities, informal leaders are very important here because they are used by the state to justify the war. Those who spoke against the war, they suffer consequences such as canceling their. So the cancel culture concerns both. On the one hand, you can be canceled if you support the regime. On the other hand, you can be canceled if you criticize the regime, depending on who your target audience is. Is it all working at the end? I need one more minute. So is it all working at the end of the day? There are different sources of data over Russia's support, public support for this war. We need to keep in mind, of course, the methodology and all of these nuances, because there are different types of methods that have been used. But here is some statistics from Levada, that apparently 81% of respondents support the actions of Russian armed forces in Ukraine. Is this because of the media? Is this because propaganda works? Is this number exaggerated? Is it actually not 81 but 71? That that we need to, of course, on the one hand investigate. On the other hand, does it make a difference? Because even if 15 or 20% support, that is quite problematic. That means that the system of informing audiences somehow works. And what we are back in, this is my concluding slide, this digital iron curtain. Is this the return of Pravda? Is this the return of the totalitarian rule of the media? And if I played the soundtrack to the Moment of Hope, to the Wind of Change, then I have another soundtrack here, and it's the song by the Beatles, Back in USSR. I have no reasons to be hopeful or positive at this moment of time about Russia's domestic media scene. Anyone who could leave, left. Yes, they are continuing to maybe broadcast, but from abroad. Access to that information, to that real information, is limited in Russia domestically, and moreover, gaining access to that information can potentially be even dangerous, just like in those times with Samizdat, where people were typing on these typewriters, their homemade newspapers, that the KGB could backtrack you even by the fact that you were using this typewriter made in GDR. You can be, of course, tracked through quite a few other alternatives now in this digital environment that Haggerty and Erickson described as disappearance of disappearance. Disappearing is impossible. The law is used selectively, and anything you say can be used against you. I will finish here, and I'll gladly answer questions if I can. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Rashid. Now I'm hearing myself, actually. So, yes, thank you very much for your lecture and for your insights on current Russian media landscape, and especially for historical background, which I think is quite useful to understand the present situation. So if anyone might have questions on the topic, please be welcome to put them in the chat. And I see there are 2 questions already. I just would read them. First question by Hilde. Although I love the Russian country, culture and language, my gut feeling, be careful, always keeps me alert. How is it possible that in those 22 years with Putin in power, we allowed it to get this far? Total isolation will be a possible solution. Only too many Western countries are still too intertwined, dependents. We should also do business in a more intelligent way to better arm ourselves. Or do you think this remains a utopia with Putin? Quite.
Hilde, thank you for this question. In my response, so please don't take my responses personally, okay? I respond through my, and I should make also a disclaimer that these are my own views. But when we raise a question through this positioning of we have to be critical in who we are, who you define as we, what is the power position of those who allow or don't allow something. Are they holier than thou and completely, apolitical and free of also? Okay, let me continue then with this biblical terminology. Are they free of sin? Yeah, so to speak. What is the position of we in this domain? In my view, people are just acting throughout from their own interests, and things are happening chaotically on the political domain. And whatever was happening in Russia at one point, maybe no one cared. Maybe somebody cared from a business period, but it wasn't the point where there is this collective union, collective decision in the EU. There are no collective decisions over anything. Look at the issue of abortion. Look at the issue of immigration. Look at the differences on views here domestically in the European Union between Poland, Hungary, or the Netherlands. Is there a unified voice? Is there a unified strategy? No, there is quite a few differences. Look at the Bulgaria's reaction, for instance, to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Yeah. So let's not forget about that. So once we are done with we to me doesn't exist. There is no collective, great, saintly, holy, wonderful we. That is out the window. Political relations between Russia and the West, they have been challenging, but they have also been profitable. You are precisely right, Hilda, in this regard. And we can see that these ties, this reliance, over-reliance on gas, on oil, has how it played out. Language also matters. And, I come from Central Asia. My home country is Uzbekistan. And linguistically, there are some interesting things to consider as well, because, and in his speeches, Putin makes these remarks sometimes. Well, he made quite a famous one by saying that Russia's borders don't end anywhere, because everywhere where there are Russian speakers is Russia. That's quite the position. So there is this imperial view, this longing for the past on the Russian side. But we have to ask ourselves a question. Is there also this longing for the past on the Western side? And what is the Western side to begin with? I would also invite you to consider such leaders here. I mean, look at how popular was Marine Le Pen in France in the recent election. Yes, she didn't lose, but let's look at the support. The fact that a leader like Trump was the president of the United States. So to me, it's not this matter of us versus them, the Avengers versus the orcs. It is the reality. There are terrible people, power corrupts. This can happen in any country. This happened in Russia for a variety of reasons. I outlined you the historical perspective and the reason why people support. Some genuinely share these views, some genuinely share these empirical ambitions, some genuinely believe that there is a special position for Russia in this world. Others maybe do this out of fear, others have no choice, and others want to speak up, but can't, are limited, or they had to flee, or if they do speak up, they will suffer severe consequences. That's the unfortunate reality.
Okay. Thank you. Next question is by Gael. Thank you for this very insightful lecture. Although a lot of media closed down, YouTube seems to remain quite free. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I wouldn't say it's quite free. Yeah, YouTube is present, and YouTube is necessary for the regime because the regime wants to deliver its messages through YouTube. Quite remarkable, quite interesting things are happening there as well, because both the platforms and the regimes react, or the governments reacted. For instance, YouTube ended monetization, weeded out some of the content, closed some of the programs, but the nature of sharing things online is such that, for instance, they banned the program of Vladimir Solovyov. I showed you the image of he was receiving the medal from Putin, this chief propagandist. But his episodes can still be released. I can open a new channel every minute and put my video there, and share it where I need it. By virtue of sharing it thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of times, I can still deliver my narrative, and then it will live on other platforms. It'll live in people's smartphones. They will send it to each other through their messengers. So this echo chamber effect, where people go towards the content that they already feel that speaks to them, and they will try to convince their relatives that this is the truth, and they will share. So YouTube is a necessary tool for now, because there is simply no alternative. You see, there is technological struggles in Russia, like this fiasco with Rosgram, and yet there is RuTube, of course, but there is no capacity to host that many videos or to offer that same service as YouTube offers. So for that reason, YouTube is still present. However, the content is ultimately controlled, because what you say on YouTube, the consequences can be severe. For the sake of time, I skipped a couple of points about humor, for example. A lot of the comedians now, they don't need television. They don't need a censor to approve their jokes or not approve, because they can open their YouTube channel and speak up on YouTube. Some of their jokes have led to their deportation from Russia. You know, some of them who were on residence permits in Russia, who were coming from the so-called near abroad, let's say Azerbaijan or Belarus, they had to flee Russia for being critical. Humor, I think somebody in the Kremlin learned the lessons from the end of the 1980s, when humor and the exposure, the king is naked type of narratives, when they expose the reality, humor is also dangerous for the state, and the state wants to keep complete control over the narrative, and humor including. And these showcase deportations, pressure, and so on. They are used once again to instill fear and to force people to self-censor. So I gave you a long answer, but simple take-home message is YouTube as a platform is necessary for the regime, and the content shared on it is controlled.
Okay. Next question. How sustainable do you think a digital iron curtain is? Do you think you can maintain that level of control by fear for years?
Very difficult question, impossible to predict what will happen next. Obviously, at one point, no one could imagine that the Soviet Union would collapse. It was unimaginable. And suddenly it's gone. And suddenly people embrace and are open. Like I showed you these images, yeah, Motley Crue comes and police are hanging out with Motley Crue. Can you imagine? Yesterday, they would arrest you for wearing jeans. Today, they're taking a picture with Motley Crue. Maybe, and this ultimately, I only would welcome this reality, of course, that today they're arresting you for sharing a video, you know, that exposes the regime. Tomorrow they will be standing next to you, you know, and clicking like on that video. I don't know, to use some of the modern, you know, incarnations of these types of reactions. I don't know. That, of course, is hard to predict. It depends on what will happen after Putin, but we also, so first we have to be careful with predicting the future, but we also have to base our scenarios, because we can only paint scenarios, on rational thinking. What is there? What kind of? There are, of course, business interests. Yeah, there are people who are relying on these platforms to make money, who are maybe apolitical, like celebrities, you know, influencers. There are companies that had to suspend operation in Russia, but probably would also be quite willing to come back to the market and to continue their operation. So, if this interest, you know, gets a dominant position, then maybe things can be different. But I say different, but I don't say undone. This is a point of no return, and there is a reason why I use this wording. It will be remembered for decades. What's happening now, this post-Putinism. Yeah, we use as post-Soviet scholars. This is what we label ourselves: post-Sovietism. 30 years the country doesn't exist. We use this term. For 30, 40, 100 years there will be a term post-Putinism, post-Putin's Russia. What's happening now will not be forgotten. What's happening now, especially with the current level and capacity of archiving, digital archiving, recording, and the collective memory that is being stored, that is, even if some of the companies return, even if magically the new leader will come, I don't know, somebody gets poisoned, somebody comes to power instead, and you know, says, okay, we are open again, McDonald's returns, critical thinking returns, everyone is welcome back, and there are no more foreign agents. There will not be an easy journey to undo the damage. It will be the same fate as Germany suffered after World War II. It will have to take education, open discussions. Whether that will be reality, I hope, but you know, I don't know.
Next question has a historical reference. I noticed that there's quite a new trend in framing Ukrainian leaders, for example, depicting Zelensky and other politicians as drug users, drunks, etc.
Yes.
Russia does it quite often, but I've seen it elsewhere too. I was wondering whether that kind of framing was also used during Soviet times. I guess it did, the immorality of the enemy, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, this Ben, wonderful observation. I had to make some selections on what I would include in the presentation and what to cut out for the sake of time. But you are precisely right. Recently, there are these waves of portraying Zelensky, a very poorly made montage of him, snorting cocaine, also linking it to Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Lavrov's speech, where he says, "I don't know what this guy is on. I don't know what he drinks or snorts." It's not a direct quote, but just to paraphrase what he said about roughly, basically hinting that Zelensky might be on drugs, and then this poorly made montage showing Zelensky as this insane person. And you have to understand that comes, first of all, that comes in a combination of narratives, and it comes out of different types of sources. They always operate in form and content, form, official statements by the MFA, television, and online communities, online blogs, discussions, these groups I mentioned globally. Content, demolishing Zelensky's reputation. I've seen some shared among Russophone groups in Germany where Zelensky is wearing a SS uniform, Nazi uniform. I mean, again, poor Photoshop, but basically framing him as a Nazi, framing him as a druggie, framing him as a fascist, or framing him as a jokester as well. Yeah, quite a few references were to the fact that he was a comedian or an actor, like laughing at him. Ha ha ha! An actor cannot be a president. An actor cannot make these types of decisions for the country. In the Soviet times, that reference to morale also was present, but not to that extent, I believe. Because I'm more engaged with modern, of course, Russian media discourses and narratives, I wouldn't be able to give you precise examples. But nowadays, I think with the technology and with the strategies and with this, it's just to such a different degree, it's to such a different level. The affordances of the media are different, and it's just penetrating through so many domains that, of course, in the Soviet times was impossible to offer. People were simply limited to radio, television, newspaper, and there were other narratives to deliver rather than this kind of yellow press, poorly made in somebody's kitchen type of allegedly discrediting or reputation damaging. I don't know who falls for this episodes, I would say.
In one of Ekaterina Schulman's videos, Ekaterina Schulman is a Russian economist and a popular figure on Russian YouTube as well. She mentioned approximate number of people who refused to participate in war-related surveys. If I remember correctly, the number was around 90% or close to it. Can we really believe any surveys around this topic in modern Russia, considering all the limitations, laws, and fear? If not, is there any chance to find a true number of supporters to understand how Russian society is divided now?
Thank you, Evgeny, for this question. That's why I mentioned that we have to look at the methodology. There are 3 or 4 different surveys that I encountered, and one was actually carried out by Navalny's team, and their narrative was, of course, that the Russians don't support this war. But then if you look at the methodology, it's 500 people in Moscow, internet users. That's not representative of anything, right? So we cannot say Russians don't want war, Russians want war. At this point, because of these limitations that you have mentioned, or because of the limitations that Ekaterina Schulman mentioned, we can only say that those who responded, this is what they think. Yet these representative statistics are out the window at this point of time. Of course, when you come door to door, in this environment of fear. Not only is it fear, it's also this fear of snitching, right? So one of other topics that I can bring in now, didn't fit into the presentation, is the return of the snitching culture. People are invited to monitor each other, to basically, just like in the darkest points of the Soviet rule, where you see your colleague or your neighbor wearing jeans, listening to rock music, maybe smoking Marlboro, getting access to this forbidden fruit, then you could report on them. And nowadays, you are invited to do so with people who are not supporting the war. Children reporting on their teachers and so on. And of course, when someone comes to your door with a survey, you would probably lie. I mean, everything in the system is done to force you to lie or to refuse to speak. That is definitely the reality in which these surveys are carried out. Moreover, some of these, media products that I see with a Z sign, with the support, yes, go, za pobеду, they are staged, right? They're media products that are professionally made by these propagandists in chief, but then they are sent to the masses with the hope that people will embrace them and that people will, react. And some do react out of fear. You have these flash mobs where people make a Z in school, where athletes, they put a Z on their uniform, they want to show their loyalty. That motivation to do so can be informed by different, by political ambitions, by financial ambitions, by fear, by maybe your genuine position and worldview. And measuring that would be precisely impossible. That's why one of the concluding remarks on that slide that I made was, does it matter if it's 80, 70, 90, 50, or 10? What matters is the fact that and the narratives that surround this. But I have to say that how I find my sources. I speak to people in Russia. I speak to people here in Europe who are from Russia or from Ukraine. And sometimes even within Ukrainian families, there are divides. People cannot speak to each other within the family. Because I say this family who fled Ukraine has relatives in Rostov or elsewhere in Russia. And they are exposed to propaganda, disinformation. And they fall for that propaganda, for that disinformation. And at the end of the day, families cannot talk to each other. So my conclusion is that some of these media products, when they come from everywhere, everything is politicized. You are watching an entertainment show, there are news penetrating. Humor is political. When everything is political and your access to different sources of information is limited, eventually that zombieating effect comes into play. But this is not a type of conversation where we say most Russians support, most Russians don't support. I'm focusing on the media products that seem to work in quite a few cases, unfortunately. And moreover, one final point on this question, some of the concerns with this exodus of foreign platforms is that once they all leave, and if they also announce their departure and make a conscious exodus from the Russian market, then in a way, it's also aiding the state in getting even further grip over this control over the domestic narrative and the exchange of information domestically, or access to that information. Let's also not forget one final point is that the Russian population is not homogeneous, and there are different ethnic groups living in Russia, and there are different linguistic groups living in Russia. And as media professionals, or as maybe someone in the audience are political scientists, or hopefully policy makers and platform owners can also hear us out, the fact that if alternative messages are to be delivered, we cannot view Russia as homogeneous. We have to consider the local linguistic nuances, ethnic composition, and so on. There is a prime example of Ukraine 24 News that made a conscious choice to deliver the news in Russian, even though for political reasons, of course, and for the language of the aggressor is not welcomed, but they chose to deliver the news in Russian to make sure that this news reaches the audiences as an alternative to the narrative of the Kremlin.
Yeah, I think we have Time for one more question. I encounter a lot of Russians stressing for various reasons. Yeah, a politician, so I'm apolitical. While I'm critical of it, I do understand this stance, and I think it's all too widespread in post-socialist contexts, including within the EU. I think that until quite recently, many Ukrainians held on to this line or variations thereof as well. After the invasion, a line has been crossed, which makes it impossible to maintain this stance, however. Could you imagine such a line to be crossed for a critical number of Russians? What could make this happen, and what role could media play in this?
Yeah, politician, моя хата с краю. We can also add this. So it's like this doesn't concern me. You are precisely right. Yeah, people have been saying that, and at this point, I will respond to this by the example of those who are more or less visible. Yeah, because we cannot see every citizen in Russia. Whom we can see are these public people, influencers of public opinion, informal leaders. This time, this is not Krymnash. Yeah, this is not 2014. This time, it's either here or there. If you are silent, you are for this war. If you publicly say that you are against this war, then you are against it. If you are silent, you are for this war. And some of the silence has been pretty disappointing for the audiences in some cases, where they want their well, I will use this term idols, yeah, because it's fandom. Yeah, they're fans of these actors. They're fans of bloggers, influencers, singers. They're fans of these artists, and they want their idol to speak up, to say something to criticize this invasion. And if that person is silent, that means that they're supporting the war. Some of the people, of course, spoke up. And what I notice, to some audience members, that's important. And they sigh with relief. Yes, great. Thank you so much. Of course, there are forces who are working online for money and who are working, of course, for newspapers for money, who quickly frame these celebrities as enemies of the state. They start finding something to discredit them, to damage their reputation. So the response is there. If you make this statement that you're against the war, you will suffer consequences. So people who have done that, they have a plan B of sorts, a citizenship of another country, or they have already left, or maybe they want to pitch to the audience that is already of a particular political view. And some of them remain in Russia, so let's credit them for that. Others have been kind of silent, and then the answer was demanded from them. Do you or do you not support the war? And yet others were in full blast with the war. Yeah, there were some artists in Russia who on day one basically said, yes, we need to support our troops. Again, this language of, to me, it's an echo again of what was happening on the US side. So to me, it's not saints versus orcs. But basically, we need to support our troops. Go, fight, do your job, liberate, make the world peaceful through war, and we will support you. And once again, because I cannot measure the opinion of every Russian citizen, but by looking at these divisions in audiences, in the demands of a political position of the informal leaders, we can see that we can gain some insights. However, there is also a tendency to pretend that nothing is happening. There is no one single act. Yeah, let's say so. Some are concerned, some are against, some are for. Some are silent, and some are pretending that nothing is happening, continue to entertain people on television, and basically ignore the war completely as a topic.
Yeah, our time is up, but I think maybe we can have one more question. The last question was on social media platforms. Do you believe that we would see an exodus of Russian social media users to Vkontakte and Telegram, or do you think that Instagram decay and, to a very limited extent, Twitter and Facebook is temporary?
With platforms, it's interesting because we are experiencing this all in real time. We are we have gotten this reality where we acquire friends, people, and we kind of carry them on. Yeah, in the past, the generations before us who lived without social media, you make friends in school, maybe you carry on one or two, you forget others, then you meet some at the university, one or two, you forget others, you meet someone at the camp on the summer, and then you never see each other again. Now we carry on our audiences, be it our friends or be it our audiences in a larger sense when we are influencers. And abandoning or losing access to these people is, of course, heartbreaking. We also, each one of us, we have this digital archive on this platform. Yeah? Our photographs, maybe voices of people who are even no longer with us that we recorded. And it's basically a personal and sometimes a public archive. From my own experience, I have friends, acquaintances, or colleagues in Russia who have said their goodbyes on Facebook. And moreover, some of them who are academics, they were forced to take down this digital archive because when the platform is deemed extremist and you are working for a university in Russia, your archive that you maintained on Facebook had to be taken down. You had to close that group. That pressure was put on them. And then they had to take it elsewhere or just destroy it and make it disappear. Most of them went on Telegram, but of course, it's a bit of a different experience in a Telegram channel or even a group than it is on Facebook as a platform. And in this regard, of course, for some people, it's difficult. Others kind of are waiting out. Yeah, maybe they didn't completely close that archive, but they're becoming less active on Facebook, especially if they're in Russia, and so far waiting for things to improve. And in principle, what I sense, again, this is based on people I'm exposed to. People are thinking that this is something temporary. When this is over, when things are back to normal, when we are allowed again. But to me, in my view, I will only be happy if it's temporal, but it's not. And moreover, I think that I will not repeat that point but it's no return. It's not as simple as, hey, we are back to Facebook again and that's all we care about, or we are on Instagram again, let's make money through monetization. There is a point of no return. Even if businesses are back, even if platforms are back, chances are people will start pretending that nothing has happened, but the majority will not forget. And this is not a point of pretending that this was just a temporary mistake, now let's go back to normal. There is no normal. And as far as the future is concerned, again, we can make dangerously misleading predictions. We can only look at the scenarios. And one of the likely scenarios, let's consider just one, that, given the healthcare, the access, and the power grip, that Putin is in office for another 10, 15, or 20 years. How do you foresee the future of domestic media platforms? And of course, there is a role to play for surrounding states, let's say, well, for neighboring countries. Some of the IT sector is now departing and entering Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and making camp there. Again, maybe temporary solution, but there is a proverb that there is nothing more permanent than something temporary, correct? So let's be sober in our outlook on this. For now, I'm completely concerned and I have limited reasons to be hopeful that something magical will happen and this magic wand will undo. Moreover, I don't think this undoing is even necessary because there are people who have to be kept accountable for what they have done.
Okay, well, this quite pessimistic note. I think it's our time is up, and I would once again would like to thank Rashid for his lecture and you all for being with us this
Thank you so
evening.
much. Thanks to the audience. Thanks for your excellent questions.
Yes, I also would like to take the opportunity and to invite you to our next online series lecture devoted to the war in Ukraine, which will be on 24th of May. We will host Karolina Kluchevska from Ghent Institute for International and European Studies, and she will explain how the war in Ukraine affects Central Asia region that is historically, politically, and economically tied to Russia. And next week on 4th of May, we will have a lecture with a focus on climate change and Russian permafrost melting in Siberia by Natalie Trishitz from the Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry. And this lecture will be on campus this time, but there will be also a possibility to follow it through live stream. And you can find all information on the website of the Russia platform. So thank you once again, and have a nice evening.
Thank you so much for organizing, Anna. A great evening to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.